Welcome back to the swamp, my friends. Today, to celebrate 150,000 swamp-dwelling creatures, I decided we would do one of our favorite topics. Today we are going to be reading some creepy, allegedly true stories from camping trips, sent in by viewers just like you. Helping me out today is my good friend Southern Cannibal. I figured, what better way to celebrate a big old milestone than with one of my southern friends? Now, if you enjoy his voice, be sure to check out his channel, which you can find in the top of the description. If you have a story that you would like to share in a future video, whether it be a camping story or something else, be sure to submit it at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. The stories like yours that help keep this channel going. Now, without further ado, let's get into these creepy camping stories that'll keep you out of the woods. Hi, I'm new to your channel, and I thought I'd share this story. So I live in a small town in Iowa. Behind my house is a small stretch of woods that only goes on about 3 miles. I've been going into these woods for about 7 years now, and I've had 2 encounters with a strange creature. The first encounter was when I was 10. I was back in the woods with my nephew and friend building a small shelter. I heard twigs snapping and got curious, so I crossed a small bridge we made out of tile and followed the source of the noise. I stopped cold in my tracks when I saw it. It was tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet tall, hairy, and it reeked of death. I quickly rejoined my nephew and friend, trying to ignore the creeping feeling I had. We stopped building the shelter shortly after and went inside. The next encounter I had was about a year ago. I was having a birthday party with a friend and my niece. We were just walking in the woods, trying to find a good place to set up a campsite, talking about hunting or something when I smelled it. I stopped, and so did the other 2. My friend asked me what was wrong. My eyes searched through the bushes and the trees for the source of the smell. A twig snapped and my eyes darted to a nearby tree just in time to see it hide behind it. I asked my friend if she could see it. She shook her head no. I heard another twig snap, but this time it was closer. I grabbed my niece's hands and told my friend we had to go. We were not going to be camping this day. I didn't hear any footsteps following us, so I thought we were safe. When we reached the entrance, I ran out, my friend following close behind. Later, we were in a tent watching movies on my computer. I stretched. Looking around at the tent, I saw a large hand leave the side of the tent. I quickly panicked, making sure the tent was zipped. Throughout the night, I heard long nails dragging along the tent walls. I stayed up, unable to sleep, because fear had consumed me. I had no idea what this thing was going to do. The noises stopped around sunrise and I finally managed to fall asleep. I've gone in the woods just once since that. I was alone, except for my so-called great hunting dog. I was home from school as it was a snow day. I decided to trek through the length of the woods. I shuddered as I entered the quiet, green woods. About a mile in, I felt like I was being watched. My dog was just a few feet ahead of me, tromping around, his tongue lolling about like Odie. I brushed off the feeling and continued. When I reached the final stretch of woods, my dog stopped. He was on point and in the direction of the thicker part of the trees. He growled, his haunches raised. I grabbed his collar and stomped through 3 feet of snow back home. I don't know if this was an encounter with whatever it is, but I do know that what my dog saw scared him. This may not be very scary, but I was scared out of my mind. Thank you for sharing this if you do. If you have any idea of what this may be, please comment because I have no clue as to what it could be.
So this is the story of my most dreadful experience. It may not have been the most eventful one for you guys, but just remembering it makes me shiver. The story happened in Central Europe. So, to set the story, once upon a time as a kid, I used to go to a local mountain range for a special camp to combat my asthma with fresh air. I absolutely loved the place and decided to go and refresh my memories with my husband last year. The area is secluded and full of deep forests. We got accommodation in a small hut about 5 kilometers away from the old camp and decided to go there in the morning and follow a few tracks from there. The main camp building used to be an old stone building, an old hunting house for the local nobility. The house was desolate, windows were broken, roof fallen down, and just completely abandoned. I got a bit upset, but we decided to continue to the other familiar locations. About 5 more kilometers away from the abandoned camp was another place that I used to love, a Menhir Stone. Just like in most parts of Europe, also here used to be a Celtic settlement, and though it is not Stonehenge, you can find Menhir stones in the deeper woods. This one was about 3 meters, 9 feet tall, surrounded with a small clearing. We went closer to it and decided to continue around it, down the northern side of the mountain and around to get back to our accommodation. Immediately upon passing around the stone, I got a weird feeling of being watched, but I didn't say anything. I have never felt this way around there. These were my woods. We continued on the way, expecting to bump into some other hikers. The place used to be swarming with people, but we never saw anyone for hours. The strange feeling was just getting worse, and the wood was eerily quiet. We hadn't seen anything move since passing the stone, not even a bird or a hare. I noticed that my husband was getting a bit jumpy too, looking behind us every few steps. My husband is an outdoors guy, and I've never seen him this nervous about being in the wild. He's a big guy with over 10 years of MMA training, but I could tell he was scared. We stopped talking and started walking as fast as we could, when we then turned around a rock and saw a car wreck. An old car with no tires and no windows in the middle of nowhere. Right at that time, the woods stopped being silent. It felt as if there was a whisper coming from all over, then some branches snapped right behind us. There were no words. We just booked it and ran. The whole remaining distance, about 4 more kilometers, we just ran. I couldn't describe the relief upon reaching the hut. The owner was there and he just looked at us with amusement. We must have looked like we've seen a ghost. He then later asked us where we went. We didn't say anything about being scaredy cats. My husband would be too ashamed, but we did mention the stone. "Oh, and from which side did you approach it?" the guy asked. We kind of just stared at him. People say that on the north of this one there is a Celtic burial ground, and that there were more of them marking it. I really don't know what to think, and I know it probably sounds cliche and fake, but heck, it happened. We've even decided to not discuss it further with my husband because it just makes us feel all sorts of weird. So what do you guys think? Has anybody had a similar experience? Let me know.
This had taken place a few years ago. I was with my best friend and we decided to go camping at a campsite in Flagstaff named Lockett Meadow. We had taken our dogs. After a day of hiking and exploration, we played around a fire and eventually went to sleep. I awoke in the middle of the night to find this deep figure outside our tent, burying itself into our tent. It had a weird way of hovering back and forth over my body and my dog, who was curled up awake and not moving or making a sound at the bottom of my feet. I look over and see my best friend passed out and his dog, which I'm unsure if it was awake, but clearly I was the only one between my friend and me that was experiencing this terrifying encounter. I eventually covered my head and thought about anything to make me fall asleep. The next day I asked my friend if he had somehow been awake through all this. He replied, "No," and thought I was lying. I told him maybe it was a bear, so we looked around our campsite and couldn't find anything. No trails, no prints, nothing. We also had food out on the table near our tents, and a trash bag hung up on a broken branch. So even if it was a bear, I'm surprised it didn't get into any of our stuff. Either way, I remember how scared I was seeing this weird, dark object observing our tent. Could have been the wind, a deer, a bear, who knows? But this is just one encounter out of the whole camping trip. The next night, we decide to camp at Beaver Creek. Mind you, we're in Arizona, if you wish to know. However, before we wanted to settle in, we explored Sedona. We drove to the Oak Creek and parked our car near a trail down to the water. We took our dogs and hiked to the creek. After we finished jumping in and swimming, we dried off and were about to head out. Next thing you know, we see from the corner of our eyes a big rock being thrown near us, making a huge splash in the water. We look up and can't see anything above, so we ran over stones and rocks to get a clear view of the top, and we saw nobody. We yell out foul obscenities and stuff like that and heard no one running off or anything. When we got to our next campsite at Beaver Creek and set up, my friend told me that throughout the trip we started in Flagstaff, he had rocks being thrown at him up until that big one that was thrown into Oak Creek. We looked at each other and thought maybe someone or something was following us and messing with us. Then we sort of laughed it off and said that it was impossible and that we were just trying to connect the dots to have it be a cool look-back adventure. Well, I'm glad it didn't turn into a part 3, because nothing happened that night going to the next day, where we packed up and headed home with nothing but a memory to be justified. Something happened when I was camping 20 years ago, and I can't get it out of my head. If you have any ideas about what this might be, I'm very interested in hearing it. I was visiting my uncle and cousin in rural Pennsylvania. I was about 16 and my cousin Sarah was about 12. Sarah asked me if we could go camping, which basically meant pitching a tent at the top of this huge foothill that was on the property. The foothill was very steep and hardwoods at the top. I'd never been camping before then, but I figured if anything happened we could just walk back to the house. So I said cool, no problem. We pitched the tent so the woods were directly behind it, with the tent opening face out towards the scenery in view. We roasted marshmallows and told campfire stories and got in the tent at around 11 p.m. or midnight. Sarah fell asleep right away, but for some reason, I could not. So I was just lying there, counting sheep. Suddenly, I heard leaves shuffling in the woods behind the tent, and I heard footsteps coming out of the woods behind the tent. There were a few steps, then it would stop, then a few more. As it got closer, I heard it step on large rocks. It sounded like a really large hoof, stepping on a rock because it made that same clop like a horse would. As it got closer to the tent, I could feel the impact of each step in the ground under me, so whatever it was sounded very heavy. At first, I thought it was a large buck, and I debated waking up my cousin so we wouldn't, be scared and we wouldn't miss this beautiful, majestic beast. But then I kept coming closer to the tent, closer than a deer or buck would have, and suddenly, I was overcome with this feeling of full-body dread, like something was very, very wrong. Then I heard a really bizarre sound. It sounded like it was coming from 8 to 10 feet off the ground, and the best way I can describe it is like someone had a huge roll of masking tape and was pulling it off a big section at a time. It was this odd tearing sound, for lack of a better word, and each tearing sound was loud and lasted 2 to 3 seconds. I told myself that it was a deer and it was tearing the bark off of a tree or something, and that is what the noise was. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I didn't want to risk waking or scaring Sarah, so I just laid there, as quiet as I could, praying whatever this thing was would leave. But instead of leaving, the tearing sound got closer, still 8 to 10 feet off the ground. Now, it was directly behind the tent, within 5 to 10 feet. Right then, I heard Sarah scream whisper my name, and I realized she was awake and heard it too. She asked what it was, and I told her it was fine. It was just a deer and to go back to sleep. She said, "That doesn't sound like a deer." But I insisted it was, because I was too scared to make a run for the house with whatever this thing was right outside. So, we listened to it slowly move around to the left side of the tent, still close, still making the sound every few seconds. Then, things got even weirder. It started moving around the front of the tent, where the ground dropped off steeply, so every few feet forward was almost several feet down. As this thing went around the front and stayed at the 8 to 10 foot height and was slowly moving to the right. Now, if the thing was making this sound and was standing on the ground, then the sound should have stopped or dropped several feet. But the sound stayed at the same height all the way around. I even wondered if this was a bird, but it was moving too slowly, and that wouldn't account for the footsteps or hoof steps. After the sound and hoof steps faded into the woods, Sarah and I just laid there awake the rest of the night, too afraid to leave the tent. At first light, we booked it back to the house and told my uncle what had happened. Even though he didn't know what it was, he just shrugged and didn't seem too concerned. But the experience scared me so much I've never been camping since. Since I know I didn't hallucinate or imagine it because Sarah heard it too. Has anyone else ever heard of anything like this? I've asked friends who are avid outdoorsmen, hunters, and trackers, and none of them have ever heard anything like it. This happened to me and my cousins around a decade ago when I was just 16 and my cousins were just 13 and 10. We'll call them Bill and Raymond. We had gone on a camping trip with their dad, who I'll refer to as Roger, to the Appalachian wilderness and engaged in our average camping activities like fishing, hiking, and sitting around campfires to tell ghost stories before turning in for the night. We had initially planned to stay out for longer than a week, which in the beginning was a very pleasant experience, marked by warm, sunny weather and breezy, starlit summer nights. However, around the 4th day, things started to take a turn for the strange and downright terrifying. It was in the evening, and we were sitting around the campfire, talking and laughing loudly, just your typical tumultuous adolescence. We roasted marshmallows while Roger was making dinner when I decided to get a picture of myself standing in front of the dark woods holding a large brook trout that I had caught earlier that day. This detail will be important later. Around 11 p.m., the radio that had been playing suddenly began to falter into static, causing Bill to smack it repeatedly in a misguided attempt to get it back to work. Which, honestly, didn't work. An eerie silence overtook the campsite, only occasionally broken by the periodic crackling of the fire. Even the nocturnal choir of frogs and crickets had begun to completely extinguish, along with our own racket. I remember the tense feeling of being watched as shivers ran down my arms and spine. Raymond, being the youngest, held on to his father, who tried to break the unsettling silence with an inappropriately cheerful, "Let's eat!" We turned in soon after eating, though it was distinctly hard to sleep with the deafening silence and the persistent feeling of being watched still hanging over me. The next day started off well enough. Birds were chirping, and the fresh morning breeze was gently swaying the leaves around us. We had breakfast and headed out for our planned hike. I was feeling much better than the night before and had set out looking forward to the woodland adventure. It was late in the afternoon when we finally stopped to eat lunch in a clearing, surrounded by the forest and its sounds. As we were eating, though, I felt goosebumps along the back of my arms. Just like last night, and the feeling of being watched quickly overtook me. From the looks of it, Roger and my cousins were also feeling that same uneasy feeling. As if synchronized with our discomfort, the birds also halted their singing as silence befell our hike. Tense and tired, we decided to make our way back. The entire time, the dreadful feeling of being observed only grew as we were approaching the lake. Making our way down the hiking path and reaching the bank of the lake, we stopped when we heard rustling in the distance. Roger held his hand up as if to motion us to stop and be quiet while he nervously scanned the vicinity. Again, we heard a rustle, only this time much more vigorous and seemingly closer, as if something were stalking us from within the tall grass nearby. Roger, who was holding a gun, was now on full alert and was expecting a black bear. His stance and seriousness frightened me. As my cousins and I huddled together near Roger, we stood there for what seemed like an eternity until, finally, Roger decided the coast was clear. I had spent another restless night haunted by silence. The following day, however, was the most fun I had the whole trip. In the morning, we had gone fishing out in the lake, and I caught another large fish, and after we spent the rest of the day swimming until late in the afternoon. We had arrived at the campsite around dusk, as I specifically remember the dramatic hues of orange and yellow that painted the sky in resplendent watercolor. Crickets and frogs were resonating their characteristic serenades as we approached, coming back from a day of fishing and swimming. We were laughing and stumbling as we carried our fishing gear down the trail, with Roger leading the way. Before we stepped into the campsite, Roger stopped dead in his tracks, causing me and my cousins to crash into him and to each other. Though he, a gargantuan man, didn't even seem to flinch. We looked at each other, baffled, and then we peeked out from behind him to see something which caused my legs to tremble in fear. There, right in the very center of our campsite, erected over the ashes of our long-extinguished campfire, was what I could only describe as the second most horrifying sight of my life. A grotesque effigy, apparently made of thousands of small twigs, had been banded together to form a torso and 4 limbs. At the end of both arms, twisted branches had been contrived into hands, and perched atop the torso was a large deer skull which was seemingly smeared or painted with strange crimson-colored symbols. From its large, menacing antlers hung several small wooden trinkets fashioned into symbols, which looked like the ones painted on the skull. After soaking in the dire situation, Roger snapped into action and gripped his gun, which had been swung over his shoulder. Like a drill sergeant, he ordered Bill and me to pack as much as we could as fast as we could while he started the truck, instructing us to leave anything heavy, including the tents. I had never moved so fast in my life. We left nearly everything non-essential as we haphazardly threw our belongings in the truck. Meanwhile, Roger was standing watch, gun ready, as Raymond was crying in the car. Shortly after, we sped away down the dirt path, surrounded by the soundless woods. A few days after arriving home, I remembered about that photo I took with the brook I caught fishing. I wish I had never remembered about that photo. After downloading the pictures from my digital camera, I found the photo I was looking for. There I was, cheerfully holding my catch, illuminated by the warm light from the campfire. But something had caught my eye, something I had missed while looking in the camera's screen. Hidden in the gloom of the dark forest was a faint glimpse of a partially illuminated head. After increasing the brightness on the image, I almost fell backward in pure terror. Right there, looking at me, was what appeared to be a menacing, human-like face with ghostly white skin, dark, sunken eyes, a flared nose, and what appeared to be antlers protruding from both sides of its bald head. If the effigy it had left at our campsite was the second most horrifying thing I have ever seen, this nightmarish photo would certainly take the first spot. One thing's for sure, I will never go camping again. This is a true camping horror story that occurred sometime, probably 20 years ago, in Mount Charleston outside of Las Vegas, Nevada in late October. My wife at the time and I had just adopted our husky German Shepherd mixed breed dog that we named Bear. This dog was wild looking, and we decided to go camping to bond with our new canine companion at our favorite area to camp and hike, Mount Charleston, just outside of Vegas. The next day we packed the Scout International with food, our camping gear, and our dog Bear. We drove up to the mountains, arriving near Cougar Ridge Trail off of Deer Creek Highway, arriving probably around 1600, and hiked around looking for a good spot to set up. We hiked up to the top of the cliff at about 10 minutes from where we parked the Scout, and Bear following us. We decided to hike down the side of the cliff and figured Bear would follow us, but he did not. We shouted his name for a few minutes, then suddenly at the top of the 30-foot cliff we just came down the side of, we saw Bear just standing there looking at us. He just stood there looking over the edge, then he disappeared. Less than 3 to 4 seconds later, he came flying over the cliff like Superman, landing at our feet and skidding past us down the mountain another 30 yards as rocks and dirt filled his mouth. Then he hit a large fallen tree with his face, instantly stopping him. We examined him, poured water into his mouth, and amazingly, he survived jumping off this 30-foot cliff without any major injuries and only had a little bit of blood in his mouth from the rocks and hitting the tree with his face. We had enough excitement and could tell the sun was about to set, so we decided to look for a good spot to pitch our tent and set up camp. We hiked over the next ridge away from the cliff and found a small 15-foot clearing in the middle of the group of trees. After setting up our tent, we made a fire and prepared the hot dogs for dinner. It was clear and a cool night, and it started to get cold fast, so we let the fire die down and went into our tent with Bear. I'm not sure how it happened, but somehow we got on the topics of demons as we laid there talking. A short while later, we both felt like it was time to talk about something else and got off the subject. As we laid there silently, it got eerily quiet. We could not hear a sound for a few minutes. Then Bear started to growl, followed by intense whimpering and loud barking. Then, suddenly, it felt like a force was shaking our tent from every direction simultaneously. We did not know what was happening. The violent shaking went on for what felt like at least a minute or two. Bear was barking his head off, and we were both sitting up in our sleeping bags, completely petrified. As soon as the shaking stopped, I climbed out of my sleeping bag, grabbed a knife and unzipped the tent just far enough to peek outside. I was amazed to see no one was there, and the sounds of the night were back. We immediately grabbed our flashlights, put Bear in a leash, and unzipped the tent all the way. We quickly climbed out of the tent and bolted down the side of the mountain, completing the 10-minute hike in less than 5, arriving back to where the Scout was parked, leaving our tent and gear up on the ridge. We then drove to another area near Lee Canyon Road, parked the Scout, and the 3 of us slept in the back of the Scout. As soon as the sun came up at 0700, we drove back to the original parking spot and silently hiked back to our campsite on the ridge to retrieve our gear and drove back to Vegas. We never went camping together again in Mount Charleston or spoke of the incident. Sadly, the week after the camping trip, our dog Bear ran away from home, and we never saw him again. Thanks for listening to these creepy, allegedly true stories from camping trips sent in by viewers just like you. If you have a story that you would like to share in a future video, be sure to submit it at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that help keep this show going. If you enjoyed these stories, please hit that like button as it helps me out a ton. If you're new to the channel, why not join the swamp, subscribe, and turn on notifications to never miss a new video. I upload them almost every single day, and all things natural and supernatural. Much love and appreciation to my friend Southern Cannibal. He helped me read story number 2 today, and if you enjoyed his voice, please be sure to check him out and subscribe. You can find the link to do so in the top of the description. He uploads a lot of allegedly true, scary stories on his YouTube channel, and I think you guys would definitely enjoy them. If you're not aware, you can download your favorite scary stories from the swamp on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, Stitcher Radio, and just about every other major podcasting platform out there. Thank you guys, as always, for supporting the swamp. It's insane to say that we have over 150,000 of you guys here now. If you guys made it all the way to the end, today's code word is 3030. Be sure to comment that down below to let me know that you made it to the end, and to confuse anybody who didn't. It's always so much fun to see what you guys come up with in the comments. Again, thank you guys as always for supporting these videos. I hope you enjoyed them. I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video.